Hard to Be a God is, without a doubt, the apotheosis of Gaiman's filmmaking career. He only directed 6 films, 5 if you discount the first film which he co-directed. However, with those 5 films he developed a remarkable approach to cinema, which has influenced a whole generation of young Russian directors. He was an incredibly stubborn individual, and his films are, unsurprisingly, thoroughly uncompromising. A 3-hour medieval science fiction film. It's like you're snatched out of existence and thrust onto an alien planet. Crucially, all of Gaiman's previous films were about the Stalin period. In other words, a specific, concrete, historical epoch. Hard to Be a God, on the other hand, is an abstraction. It is a parable not just about fascism, but also Stalinist terror. The questions it raises about the ethics of intervention are as problematic as they were in 1968, when Gaiman first tried to make the film. A lot of the critical response to Hard to Be a God hinges on the idea that it doesn't have a plot. It does have a plot, it's just not always clear. The film's about a scientist who's sent to a planet which is like Earth, but it's literally stuck in the Middle Ages. The scientist masquerades under the persona of Don Romata, a nobleman who is supposed to be descended from a pagan god. He's not alone, but he's part of a group. These scientists, who all have cameras fitted into their headpieces, stream a feed of life on this alien planet back to scientists on Earth for analysis. The action begins when Don Reba is elected Prime Minister of the city of Arkanar. Reba initiates a series of expulsions, executions and murders of poets, scholars, intellectuals. Don Romata, along with the other scientists, subtly intervene, smuggling scholars out of Arkanar to safety. While the scientists are able to observe life in Arkanar, they're not able to intervene. For Don Romata, this becomes more and more difficult when he gets embroiled in a conflict with a mercenary, Arata, and witnesses the death of his only friend, Baron Pampa. The only thing that really keeps him going is his love for a girl on the planet, Ari, who's pregnant with his child. Things come to a head when Ari is killed and Don Romata finally snaps and instigates an insurrection which results in the death of Don Reba. After this, the scientists all return to Earth, except for Don Romata, and he asks his colleagues to explain that it is hard to be a god. With the exception of his first film, all of Alexei Gaiman's films were written with his wife, Svetlana Karmelita. Karmelita has always maintained that Hard to Be a God is a film about love and fear. At the heart of the film is Don Romata's love for Ari. There's always the threat that something terrible is about to happen, and it usually does. It's a very melancholic film. The film both begins and ends with Don Romata playing the blues. He's a Hamlet-type figure in that he questions his own ethics. He perceives and judges himself both through inaction and, ultimately, his actions. This element, of course, is part of the novel upon which Gaiman's film is based, Hard to Be a God, by Arkady and Boris Strugatsky. However, Gaiman brings this out further by having Don Romata quote Hamlet, a poem by Boris Pasternak.
Гул затих, я вышел на подмостки, прислоняясь к дверному косяку. Я ловлю в далеком отголоске. Гул затих. Гул затих, я вышел на подмостки, прислоняясь к дверному косяку. Я ловлю в далеком отголоске, что случится на моем веку. На меня наставлен сумрак ночи.
Hard to Be a God is probably the Strugatsky brothers' most famous novel. The Strugatskys were extremely popular in not just the Soviet Union, but Eastern Europe, and they also had a cult following in Germany. In fact, many of the first English translations of their novels were from German translations. In the Anglophone world, the Strugatskys were championed by the American science fiction writer Theodore Sturgeon. In the West, the Strugatskys are probably most famous for writing a novel called Roadside Picnic, which formed the basis of Andrei Tarkovsky's film Stalker. There have been many films based on the Strugatsky's novels. Days of the Eclipse, for example, by Alexander Sokurov, is based on one of their stories, as is a film by Konstantin Lubushansky, Ugly Swans. There's also a very interesting Estonian film based on Dead Mountaineer's Hotel. Along with the Polish author Stanislaw Lem, the Strugatskys were key figures in the field of Eastern European science fiction. Lem, of course, is most famous for writing Solaris, which was filmed not just by Andrei Tarkovsky, but also Steven Soderbergh. Both Lem and the Strugatskys are sometimes described as soft science fiction writers. Some authors base their work on scientific extrapolations of ideas in the natural sciences, physics, chemistry, or biology. A good example of this is the American writer Carl Sagan, or 2001, which presents a very realistic image of space travel in the future, or at least as how that was perceived in 1968. Soft science fiction, on the other hand, refers to ideas extrapolated from the social sciences, psychology, sociology, and political science. The distinction, of course, is not clear-cut. Both the Strugatskys and Lem were well versed in the social sciences and the natural sciences. Take a novel like Solaris. Lem is focused primarily on the psychology of space travel, what effect the kind of loneliness and the monotony has on the psyche. Similarly, Hard to Be a God is about the ethics of encountering an alien species. I mean, this type of fiction is analogous to the type of science fiction which Philip K. Dick was writing in the West. In fact, Lem was a great admirer of Philip K. Dick and translated many of his works into Polish. Dick's The Man in the High Castle, for example, which was written a few years before Hard to Be a God, is a similar parable about fascism. Very broadly speaking, this socially orientated science fiction chimed to some extent with the political ideologies of the time. Science fiction stories are often set in the future, and this, of course, fed into utopian ideals. Many of the Strugatsky's novels are set in the Noon universe, a hypothetical future in which the communist project was successful. Hard to Be a God, for example, deals in part with two factions, the Greys and the Blacks. These are analogous to the Brown Shirts and the SS which followed them. This allegory was not just applicable to Nazi Germany. Don Rebe is a very thinly veiled anagram of Beria, Stalin's head of secret police. When the Strugatskys wrote Hard to Be a God, Nikita Khrushchev was in power. In 1956, Khrushchev gave his famous secret speech in which he denounced Stalin's crimes. After Khrushchev's secret speech, there was a thaw in Soviet cultural life, which led to a period of relative freedom in the arts. However, by the mid-1960s, many of these freedoms were being curtailed, as it was still rather adventurous to compare Beria with Don Rebe in the novel. Hard to Be a God has been associated with Gehrman throughout his career. He initially planned it to be his film debut. He was to start shooting in 1968. But a few days before production was to commence, the Soviet forces invaded Czechoslovakia. Of course, this story about Russians travelling to and subtly influencing an alien land was deemed a bit awkward, and the project was cancelled. Throughout the 1970s, Gehrman tried repeatedly to mount a film of Hard to Be a God, but his case wasn't helped by the fact that many of his films were banned. Gehrman's luck began to change in the 1980s when Mikhail Gorbachev seized upon his body of work as a cinematic example of perestroika, an attempt at re-examining the Soviet past. Not only were his films finally distributed, but also Gorbachev invited him, along with Georgian filmmaker Tengiz Abaladze, to the United States, and Gehrman presented his films both in New York and San Francisco. A key figure in the release of these films is Elem Klimov, who is perhaps best remembered as the director of Come and See. During the 1980s, Klimov also had an administrative role, and he fought long and hard for the release of both Gehrman and Abaladze's films. Towards the end of the 1980s, just when it seemed that Gaiman was finally going to be able to make Hard to Be a God, the Soviet authorities entered into a co-production with West Germany to make a film directed by Peter Fleischmann. Fleischmann's film of Hard to Be a God takes certain liberties with the Strugatsky's novel. While the novel clearly depicts a medieval world, Fleischmann's is a kind of low-rent Dune, a very overt space opera. The Strugatskys were not only unhappy with the film, they saw the failure of Fleischmann's adaptation as all the more reason for Gaiman to make his version. Then the Soviet Union collapsed and film production plunged into chaos. To make matters worse, Arkady Strugatsky died in 1991. So Gaiman started to make Krustali of My Car, which he envisaged as a sort of stepping stone towards Hard to Be a God, a much bigger production. However, Gaiman's particular way of working, coupled with the instability of the Russian economy, resulted in the production stretching over much of the 1990s. The film finally premiered in 1998 at the Cannes Festival, where it was met largely with incomprehension by international critics. However, in the decade which followed, it became a cult film, not just in Russia, but also France too. Gaiman's position within Russian film circles started to change, and by the end of the 1990s, he was widely considered in Russia by Russian filmmakers and critics as the most interesting Russian filmmaker. The story goes that Vladimir Putin, who had just been appointed the Russian president, gave Gaiman an award recognizing his contribution to cinema. Gaiman reportedly gave Putin a copy of Hard to Be a God. A few years later, at the beginning of the century, Gaiman began production on Hard to Be a God, with much of the money coming from Russian state television. Filming began, ironically, in Czech Republic, with Russian soldiers playing the soldiers we see in the mass crowd scenes. Between 2005 and 2006, I worked with the Slovak filmmaker Jure Jakubisko on a film called Bathory. Bathory was set in the Renaissance. One of the locations where Bathory was shot was a castle about an hour's drive from Prague called Točnik. And this castle is actually in Hard to Be a God. And in between setups, I remember getting into conversations with many of construction workers and art directors, and I would hear stories about the rain, the mud, and this crazy Russian director, and this endless shoot. After the shoot in the Czech Republic, the production shifted to St. Petersburg, where Gaiman filmed in the Len Film Studios. Shooting dragged on for another few years, and after that Gaiman entered post-production. Many people began to doubt whether the film would see the light of day. During the making of Krustali of My Car, Gaiman started to develop very specific ideas about the soundtrack of his films, specifically the way they're mixed. One of the characteristics of both Krustali of My Car and Hard to Be a God is an immersive approach to sound design. We're not meant to hear everything clearly. We're often hearing snatches of conversation, phrases, anecdotes disappearing into the background. This, of course, requires a very kind of elaborate kind of approach towards sound editing and mixing. Gaiman died in early 2013 before he'd completed work on this. The film was ultimately completed by Svetlana Karmelita and their son, Alexei Gaiman Jr., who's a very notable director in his own right. The film finally premiered at the end of 2013 at the Rome Film Festival. Gaiman's adaptation of the Strugatsky's novel differs from the book in a number of ways. There are some very good reasons for this. The Strugatskys wrote their novel during the communist period, and Gaiman was finally making his film in the post-communist period. Needless to say, it would be anachronistic to set a film in a hypothetical future in which communism was successful. There are very few references to life on Earth in Gaiman's film. There are no scenes set on Earth to contrast it with life in Arkanar, for example. There are two films which make useful comparisons with Gaiman's Hard to Be a God. The first is Tarkovsky's Andrei Rublev. Tarkovsky's film tells the story of an icon painter. Just as Don Rumata's task is to observe and subtly influence life in Arkanar, Rublev's task is to paint or write icons Whereas what keeps Rublev going is his faith in God, Don Ramata doesn't have such a luxury. He is, in fact, the god. There's also a formal parallel between the two movies. Tarkovsky's film was both innovative and controversial for its fragmented, episodic, and elliptical approach to storytelling. The character of Rublev, for example, doesn't always appear and participate in many of the episodes of the film. He doesn't take center stage, he's merely a detail in a much broader canvas. Hard to Be a God has a similar structure. We don't see life on Earth. We don't see much of the Arkanar massacre itself. The second film is Andrzej Żuławski's On the Silver Globe. Żuławski's film was based on a trilogy of books written by his great-uncle, Jerzy Żuławski, the Moon Trilogy. The first book tells the story of a group of astronauts who travel to the moon to colonize it. What we're reading is a record of this attempt at colonization. In Andrzej Żuławski's film, this is presented in the form of a video diary. The first part of the movie is shot almost in an entirely subjective manner. And just like the scientists in Hard to Be a God, one of the characters in the Silver Globe is fitted with a camera which records their experiences in an almost point-of-view fashion. The second part of Jerzy Żuławski's trilogy involves a scientist who reads the diary and decides to go to the moon to see what has become of the colony. The scientist goes to the moon and finds out that the original colony has died. Nevertheless, the offspring of the colony develop a religion, which begins in a shamanic form, and as the story progresses, becomes more and more organized. When the scientist arrives, he's perceived to be a god. They have a prophecy and expect the scientist to lead them out of oppression. Again, this is not dissimilar to the way Don Ramata is perceived. His knowledge is seen as a sign of his pagan supernatural heritage. While it seems highly unlikely that Gaiman got to see Żuławski's film, nevertheless, the Moon Trilogy is widely known, not just in Eastern Europe, but around the world. It's translated into many languages, except English. It was cited by Stanislav Lem as the book or the books which inspired him to write science fiction. I think most importantly, the Moon Trilogy uses science fiction as a vehicle for philosophical exploration. I mean, Jerzy Żuławski studied philosophy. He wrote his thesis on Spinoza in Switzerland. He translated Nietzsche and the Talmud into Polish. So this was someone approaching science fiction as a means of conducting an elaborate literary thought experiment, a bit like Anthony Burgess in A Clockwork Orange. Regardless of the critical response to Gaiman's films, I think most critics agree that he's a remarkable stylist. He was always searching for the right frame, the right movement, the right light, anything to convey the emotion required by the story. And he really pushed the conventions of storytelling in cinema to the point where many people think a film like Hard to Be a God does not have a plot. His films are hyper-realistic in that there is an excruciating attention to detail. Not just in terms of performances, but also props, sets, locations, dialogue. Gaiman approached cinema as a totally immersive experience. He knew that you didn't need IMAX, you didn't need 3D to plunge the viewer into a world. Gaiman comes from the same tradition as Orson Welles, using short focal length, wide-angle lenses, a big depth of field to show both the foreground and the background. Sound which sounds not like movie sound, but the way we actually hear things in the world around us. It doesn't just remind us of the approach to cinema which Welles had, but also one in Soviet cinematography, in particular the collaborations between the Georgian director Mikhail Kalatozov and the cinematographer Sergei Urusevsky, particularly a number of films they made in the late 1950s and early 1960s, starting with The Cranes Are Flying. Urasevsky developed an approach to the camera which he referred to as the emotional camera. This was a camera which is totally the opposite to, say, the Ken Loach approach towards cinematography. That type of cinematography, the camera is a kind of substitute for eyes, peering in on the conversation, and it shouldn't interrupt with the action. Urasevsky's approach was to kind of plunge the camera right into the heart of the action. What was the most dynamic angle? What was the most expressive movement to convey the strong emotions demanded by the film? As a consequence, I mean, all of this, these strange angles and this hyper-realism, I mean, it gives a very kind of slightly distorted, grotesque vision. Gaiman used to explain this by comparing it to refraction. So, for example, when you put a stick into a stream, it appears broken. Therefore, by the same logic, in order to cut straight to the truth of a story, emotion, or a performance, it's necessary to find a similar distortion either through performance, dialogue, or camera work, any depiction of the real world. There is a kind of a deliberately baroque, grotesque strategy in search of truth. When asked about his profession, Gaiman always recognized himself as first and foremost a theatre director. That was, of course, his training. He was remarkable not just in terms of directing actors, but in casting. He wasn't afraid of drawing out performances which might be considered theatrical or over the top. Theatricality is usually frowned upon in cinema, but Gaiman wasn't afraid. He wanted this kind of heightened, hyper-realist kind of approach towards performance. And Gaiman was the son of a writer. His father wrote plays, short stories, screenplays. Some of his plays were even staged by the famous Russian theatre director Vsevolod Meyerhold. His real breakthrough as a theatre director was when he staged a play by Yevgeny Shvarts. This got him noticed, and he was invited to the Bolshoi Drama Theatre by Georgy Tovstonogov. He was to study under Kozintsev, but he ended up studying film at the Russian Film School, VGIG. When writing Hard to Be God, the Strugatskys used Alexander Dumas' The Three Musketeers as a model. They were keen to kind of add some piss and shit into the texture. The joke was that if a communist official suddenly found himself with the dirt and the flies of the people depicted in this story, they would become a petit bourgeois. In Gaiman's film, and this is particularly obvious when you compare it to Fleischmann's adaptation, he really goes to town with the mud, the piss, the blood, the shit. The paintings of Hieronymus Bosch and also Bruegel are very obvious reference points for Gaiman, but he approaches them not in a phantasmagoric fashion, but as realistic paintings. There's a strong emphasis on both eating and defecation. This very much brings to mind the French writer François Rabelais, in particular his novel Gargantua and Pantagruel. I mean, Gaiman's film begins with someone taking a dump. Our introduction to Don Ramata is him waking up, hungover, surrounded by half-eaten food. It's interesting to compare this aspect of the Strugatsky's novel, and in particular Gaiman's treatment of these elements in his film, with a book which was published in the late 1960s, although it was conceived much earlier. And that's Study of Gargantua and Pantagruel by the philosopher Mikhail Bakhtin. Bakhtin's book argues, amongst other things, that the novel as a genre, represented by Rabelais' Gargantua and Pantagruel, developed out of past popular festival forms. He's probably most famous for developing the category of carnival. For Bakhtin, the carnivalesque in literature is characterized by a number of things. Normal hierarchies we encounter in society are done away with. People of different social standings mix together. The eccentric as a departure from the daily grind. Different combinations of values. High and low art, the sacred and the profane. Profanity, blasphemy. In his study of Dostoevsky, Bakhtin used the example of the train ride which opens Dostoevsky's The Idiot, in which Prince Myshkin takes a train from Warsaw to St. Petersburg, and in the train carriage encounters an array of criminals. So the train carriage becomes a public space in which the aristocracy can mix with the criminal world. Gaiman was very good at focusing on these social, communal spaces in all of his films, Ivan Lapshin, Krustalev My Car, and it's very much the case and also the heart of Hard to Be a God. The film is a constant collision between dons, kings, prime ministers, prostitutes, soldiers, monks, slaves, priests, scientists and scholars. Bakhtin's study was remarkable for the way he described and focused upon grotesque bodies in Rabelais' fiction. But the way he approached the body was not so much in a literal sense, but as a metaphor for the body of the people as a whole. I think Hard to Be a God is a good example of what Eisenstein described as intellectual cinema. Back in the late 1920s, Eisenstein proposed a new film genre, one focusing not so much on story as ideas. October, for example, his film of the October Revolution. There's a sequence in the film which sets out to undermine the authority of the church. Eisenstein juxtaposes familiar Christian iconography with more exotic objects and artifacts from other religions. Regardless of the effectiveness of the scene, it's a very concerted attempt at using cinema as a language, a means not just of eliciting emotions, but thoughts. This is how propaganda films work, it's also how advertising works. And it goes back to when Lenin wrote about film as the most important art, and Trotsky writing about cinema, vodka and the church. Hard to Be a God is ultimately about ethical contemplation. Gaiman's early films were shelved by the Soviet authorities not because they were perceived as being counter to the ideology of the time, but rather that there was no real distinction between the protagonist and the antagonist. Characters were grey, and Hard to Be a God, like all of Gaiman's films, is a grey film. It may be black and white aesthetically, but morally all the characters are grey and black.